December 12, 1943. The pre-dawn air bit with winter's chill as Private James Harrington exhaled a plume of vapor into the darkness. Hunched over the breech of a massive M2A1 howitzer outside Saint-Lô, France, his hands moved with practiced precision, opening, loading, closing, each motion performed hundreds of times in training, now executed with stakes infinitely higher. German counterattack imminent. Artillery support desperately needed. Harrington's battery had been firing continuously for 6 hours. "Range 6,400, called out Lieutenant Wilson, voice hoarse from shouting coordinates all night. "Azimuth 235. Harrington glanced up, locking eyes with the 5 other men of the gun crew, their faces illuminated by the dim red glow of the aiming light. 8 months ago, they had been factory workers, farmers, and college students. Now they were the mechanical heart of American artillery, the element that turned mathematical calculations into high-explosive reality. The breech slammed shut with a metallic thunk. "Ready!" Harrington shouted. Sergeant Miller pulled the lanyard. The ground trembled as the howitzer erupted with a deafening concussion, briefly lighting up the French countryside with its fiery discharge. The 105mm projectile arced invisibly through the night sky, carrying 33 pounds of high explosive toward an enemy position over 4 miles distant. But this remarkable efficiency, one that would help break the back of German resistance and save countless American lives, was not born in the crucible of combat. It had been forged methodically on training fields across America, where men like Harrington first learned to operate the weapon that military historians would later call the backbone of American ground firepower in the European theater. While Allied commanders would credit the 105mm howitzer with delivering 1 out of every 5 artillery shells fired by American forces throughout the entirety of World War II, few would ever know the extraordinary story of how ordinary men were transformed into the most lethal and precise artillery crews in military history. No one in the 903rd Field Artillery Battalion knew that the rigorous training program that Private Harrington and thousands like him endured would forever change modern warfare, establishing an American artillery doctrine that would remain essentially unaltered for nearly 50 years. Growing up in Deerfield, Illinois, James Harrington had never imagined himself as a soldier, let alone an artilleryman. The son of a carpenter and a schoolteacher, he had spent his youth immersed in books and helping his father in his workshop, developing the meticulous attention to detail and steady hands that would later serve him well on the gun line. Jimmy was always building things, his mother would later tell a reporter from the Chicago Tribune in 1946. Always measuring twice, cutting once, as his father taught him. When he joined the Army, we thought they'd put him in engineering. Never imagined he'd be firing those big guns. When the draft notice arrived in early 1942, Harrington was 23, working as a clerk at the regional hardware distributor and taking night classes in accounting. Pearl Harbor had changed everything. Like millions of young Americans, Harrington dutifully reported to the induction center, where a battery of tests and interviews determined his assignment. They asked if I had experience with mathematics, Harrington recalled in a 1975 oral history interview preserved in the National Archives. I told them I'd completed 2 years of college-level math courses. That, and the fact that I scored well on the mechanical aptitude test, sealed my fate. Next thing I knew, I was on a train to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the home of Army Field Artillery. Fort Sill had been training American artillerymen since 1911, but nothing in its history compared to the massive expansion that occurred after America's entry into World War II. What had been a relatively small school with specialized courses suddenly became a vast training complex, processing thousands of recruits. The Army needed artillerymen, lots of them, to crew the thousands of howitzers being manufactured in American factories. During his first days at Fort Sill, Harrington and his fellow recruits were introduced to the bewildering world of artillery terminology, deflection, quadrant, aiming circle, gunner's quadrant, reciprocal laying, parallel fire. These strange terms would soon become as familiar as their own names. They started us with the basics, Harrington explained. Before we ever touched a howitzer, we learned the mathematics of indirect fire, how to calculate range and deflection based on forward observer coordinates, how weather and altitude affected the trajectory. I remember thinking it was like a geometry class, but with life and death consequences. The Field Artillery School had developed a methodical training program, refining techniques originally established during the First World War and vastly improving upon them. Recruits started with classroom instruction, learning the theory before moving to practice. The system emphasized repetition, precision, and teamwork. Our instructor, Sergeant Wagner, had a saying, Harrington recalled, "In the infantry, a mistake might kill a man. In the artillery, a mistake might kill a company." He drilled that into us every day. Artillery was about precision, consistency, and above all, safety. 1 degree of error at the gun translated to hundreds of yards at the target. After 3 weeks of classroom training, Harrington and his cohort finally met the weapon that would become the focus of their existence, the M2A1 105mm Howitzer. It was bigger than I expected, Harrington admitted. 19 feet long when set up for travel. Weighing over 2 tons, the barrel alone was 7 feet 7 inches long. When I first saw it, I couldn't imagine how 8 men could possibly maneuver something so massive. But the Army had figured it all out, down to the smallest detail. The howitzer crews came from diverse backgrounds. Private Michael Donovan had been a steel worker in Pittsburgh. Corporal Thomas Jenkins had taught high school mathematics in Oregon. Private First Class Robert Martinez came from a ranching family in New Mexico. Together, they would form a cohesive unit, where each man's background contributed something unique to the team. Martinez could diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone, Harrington noted. Jenkins could calculate firing solutions faster than anyone else in the battery. Donovan had the raw strength to move parts that sometimes got stuck. We became a family, each with our own strengths. The Army was smart that way, blending us together into something greater than our individual talents. But the transition from civilians to artillerymen was not always smooth. Many recruits struggled with the demanding physical requirements and complex technical knowledge required. We lost about 30% of our original training group, Harrington recalled. Some couldn't handle the mathematical aspects. Others couldn't adapt to the exhausting physical demands. Moving a howitzer into position, setting up the trails, digging the spade pits, it was backbreaking work. And we had to do it quickly, over and over again, until it became automatic. During those early training days, with America's war footing still ramping up, few of the men truly grasped the importance of their role in the coming conflict. They couldn't know that by 1945, American artillery would fire over 300 million rounds at enemy positions, becoming the most feared weapon in the Allied arsenal. Nor could they anticipate that German prisoners would later report that American artillery was the most terrifying and effective weapon they faced, more than tanks, aircraft, or infantry. We were told we'd be supporting the infantry, Harrington said, but the scope of what that meant didn't sink in until much later. During training, we were just focused on mastering our roles, memorizing the procedures, and building the muscle memory that would eventually save lives, both American and, ironically, German. As winter gave way to spring in 1942, Harrington found himself gradually transformed from a civilian into a specialized military technician, part of what would become the most sophisticated artillery force ever assembled. Little did he know then that his training would soon be tested in the crucible of combat, where theory would become deadly reality, and where the difference between life and death would be measured in fractions of seconds and tiny adjustments to the gunner's quadrant. The story of the 105mm Howitzer began long before James Harrington or any of his fellow artillerymen were born. After World War I, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department had studied captured German 105mm howitzers and recognized their superiority to American models. Based on these studies, they developed the 105mm howitzer M119-20, which evolved through several designs over the following decades. The howitzer that would dominate World War II battlefields wasn't standardized until 1940, the M2A1 on-carriage M2. It represented the culmination of years of testing and refinement, combining the best elements of German design with American engineering innovations. Manufacturing began at the Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois in 1941, with production quickly ramping up as the United States entered the war. By 1945, over 10,000 of these remarkable weapons had been produced and deployed worldwide. The timing proved fortuitous. While the U.S. Army initially clung to the 75mm gun as its primary divisional artillery piece, combat experience in North Africa quickly demonstrated the superiority of the 105mm Howitzer. It could deliver a heavier, high-explosive round with greater accuracy, and its versatile carriage allowed for high-angle fire, crucial in mountainous terrain. The 75 was a fine weapon, explained Major General William Porter, who commanded the 9th Field Artillery Battalion during the Normandy campaign, but the 105 gave us the punch we needed. The difference in explosive power between a 75mm shell and a 105 was dramatic, almost 3 times greater. When we needed to suppress an enemy position or break up a concentration of troops, nothing did the job better. The American divisional artillery structure was built around this weapon. Each infantry division contained 3 105mm howitzer battalions and 1 155mm howitzer battalion. The lighter 105mm battalions were typically assigned to support specific infantry regiments, forming close partnerships that enhanced coordination and effectiveness. By 1943, we had settled on a standard organization, noted Lieutenant Colonel Edward Johnson, a post-war artillery historian at Fort Sill. A typical 105mm battalion had 18 howitzers organized into 3 batteries of 6 guns each. This gave division commanders tremendous flexibility in applying firepower exactly where it was needed. This organizational structure proved remarkably effective. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when German forces launched their surprise counteroffensive in the Ardennes, American artillery units fired over 5 million rounds in just 3 weeks, much of it from 105mm howitzers. This incredible volume of fire broke the back of the German offensive and demonstrated the maturity of American artillery doctrine. The howitzer itself was an engineering marvel of its time. With a maximum range of 7 miles, it could deliver devastating firepower from positions well behind the front lines. Its split-trail carriage allowed for a wide firing arc of 46 degrees, while the elevation mechanism permitted angles from -5 degrees to positive 65 degrees, crucial for firing into deep valleys or over steep ridges. The weapon fired semi-fixed ammunition, meaning the projectile and powder charge could be adjusted for different ranges and effects. A well-trained crew could fire up to 10 rounds per minute in emergencies, though 3 to 4 rounds per minute was more typical for sustained fire. The projectiles themselves weighed 33 pounds and could contain high-explosive white phosphorus, smoke, or illumination payloads. The versatility was what made it so valuable, explained Porter. We could fire high explosive against enemy positions, smoke to screen friendly movements, white phosphorus to mark targets for aircraft, or illumination rounds to light up the battlefield at night. One weapon, many capabilities. That's what made American artillery so effective. But the true innovation wasn't the weapon itself. It was the system built around it. The U.S. Army developed a complex but efficient Fire Direction Center, FDC system, that revolutionized artillery employment. Forward observers with the infantry would spot targets and radio coordinates back to the FDC, which would calculate firing solutions and transmit them to multiple gun batteries simultaneously. This centralized control allowed for the concentration of fire from dozens of howitzers onto a single target within minutes. The Germans couldn't figure out how we were able to bring so much artillery fire so quickly onto a target, noted Major Robert Wilson, who served as a fire direction officer with the 1st Infantry Division. Their system required each battery to calculate its own firing data, which took time and created coordination problems. Our centralized system gave us an enormous advantage in responsiveness. The effectiveness of this system depended entirely on the training of the gun crews. Each howitzer required an 8-man team working in perfect coordination: the gunner, assistant gunner, cannoneer 1 through 5, and the section chief. Every man had specific responsibilities that had to be executed with precision and speed. This is where men like Harrington and his fellow trainees came in. Their ability to quickly and accurately lay the gun on target, load the correct powder charge and projectile, and fire on command was the final link in the chain. Without their skill and coordination, the most sophisticated fire direction center in the world would have been useless. As the tide of war shifted toward the Allies in 1943, with America's industrial might producing weapons in unprecedented numbers, the challenge became one of training enough men to operate this equipment effectively. The Field Artillery School at Fort Sill expanded enormously, eventually training over 200,000 officers and enlisted men by the war's end. The transformation of civilian men into artillery specialists became one of the great unsung success stories of America's war effort. Working with complex equipment, mastering difficult mathematical concepts, and developing the discipline to function under extreme pressure, these were not simple tasks. Yet, through a combination of innovative training methods, rigorous practice, and careful selection, the Army created an artillery force of remarkable capability. What we accomplished with these young men was extraordinary, reflected Colonel Thomas Harrison, who commanded the Field Artillery Training Center at Fort Sill during 1943. We took kids from farms and cities, many with limited education, and trained them to operate sophisticated weapon systems with a degree of precision that would have been unimaginable before the war. It's a testament to American adaptability and determination. The story of Private Harrington and his howitzer crew would soon intersect with the broader flow of the European campaign. As Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, approached, the skills honed on the training fields of Oklahoma would face their ultimate test on the battlefields of France, where theory would meet reality in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. "Fall in!" The shout from Sergeant Miller cut through the early morning mist at Fort Sill. 8 weeks into their training, Harrington's howitzer crew assembled in formation, standing at attention as their section chief approached. "Today we qualify," Miller announced, his voice carrying across the training field. "Everything you've learned, everything we've practiced, it all comes together now. This isn't just about passing a test. It's about proving you're ready to support our boys when they hit the beaches in Europe or the islands in the Pacific." The qualification course was comprehensive, testing every aspect of artillery operations. Speed drills, accuracy competitions, maintenance procedures, emergency scenarios. Everything would be evaluated by instructors who had already seen combat in North Africa and Sicily. "They divided us into gun crews and gave each crew a howitzer," Harrington recalled. "We had to demonstrate every procedure: emplacement, aiming, loading, firing, displacement. They timed everything. If you were too slow or made a mistake, you failed and recycled through training." The emplacement drill came first. At the command, "Action front," the crew had to transform their howitzer from travel configuration to firing position in under 3 minutes. This involved removing the trailer from the truck, lowering the trails to the ground, raising the wheels off the ground, removing the travel lock, and preparing the breech mechanism, all while establishing communications with the simulated fire direction center. "Harrington, you're number 2 today," Sergeant Miller barked, opening and closing the breech, loading the round. "Jenkins, you're the gunner. Martinez, assistant gunner. Donovan, you're handling the trails. The rest of you know your positions. 3 minutes on my mark. Go!" They had practiced this drill hundreds of times over the past 8 weeks. Each man knew exactly what to do, moving in a choreographed sequence that minimized wasted motion and maximized efficiency. Harrington's job was critical: opening the breech, ensuring it was clear, receiving the projectile from number 3, seating it properly, then closing, and securing the breech before calling "Ready." 2 minutes, 15 seconds, Miller announced as they finished, Acceptable, but I've seen better. Next drill. The aiming procedures were even more complex. Using the panoramic telescope and gunner's quadrant, the crew had to lay the howitzer according to instructions from the Fire Direction Center. This involved setting the proper deflection, horizontal aim, and quadrant elevation, vertical aim, with precision measured in miles, an angular measurement where 1 mil equals 1/6400th of a full circle. Deflection 2840, called the instructor, simulating a command from the FDC. Jenkins, as gunner, spun the traversing handwheel while peering through the sight. 2840 set, he responded. Quadrant 315. Martinez, the assistant gunner, placed the gunner's quadrant on the breech, adjusting the elevation handwheel until the bubble centered perfectly. Quadrant 315, set. Meanwhile, Harrington stood ready at the breech, waiting for the command to load. When it came, he opened the breech block with a smooth motion, accepted the projectile from number 3, seated it firmly, then closed and locked the breech. "Ready?" he called. "Fire!" came the command. The lanyard puller yanked the cord, and the firing pin struck the primer. During live fire exercises, this would send the projectile downrange, but in this qualification test, they used dummy rounds and a simulated firing mechanism. "Reset for next mission," Miller ordered. "Ammunition team, prepare 3 rounds He, charge 4. This cycle repeated through various scenarios. Fire missions requiring multiple rounds at different deflections and quadrants, direct fire anti-tank procedures, emergency fire missions where speed was paramount, and maintenance drills where the crew had to troubleshoot common mechanical issues. Throughout it all, instructors observed and evaluated every action, noting times, checking precision, and assessing how well the crew communicated and coordinated their movements. The standard was exacting, as it needed to be for men who would soon be supporting infantry soldiers in life-or-death situations. By midday, we were exhausted, Harrington remembered. The physical demands were intense. Each projectile weighed 33 pounds, and during a sustained fire mission, we might handle dozens of them. The trails were heavy, the hand wheels required strength to turn quickly, and we were constantly in motion. But we knew the infantry would have it worse, so no one complained. The qualification culminated in a simulated combat scenario. The crew had to emplace their howitzer in a wooded area, establish camouflage, respond to multiple fire missions in quick succession, then displace to a new position, all while instructors created distractions and complications. "They threw everything at us," Harrington said. "Simulated incoming fire that required us to take cover. A wounded crew member who needed to be evacuated while the rest continued the mission. Communications failures that forced us to use alternate methods. It was as close to combat as they could make it without actually shooting at us." As the sun began to set over Fort Sill, Sergeant Miller gathered his exhausted crew. They stood in a semicircle, dirty, sweating, and anxious to hear the results. "Not bad," he said, which from Miller was high praise. "You passed, all of you. Tomorrow we start advanced training." The men exchanged tired smiles. They had cleared an important hurdle, but they knew their journey was just beginning. In the coming weeks, they would learn more specialized skills, night operations, firing through limited visibility, coordinating with infantry and armor units, counter-battery fire techniques, and the intricacies of the Fire Direction Center. That night in the barracks, there was a sense of accomplishment, Harrington recalled, but also a sobering realization that soon we'd be doing this for real, with enemy shells landing around us and men's lives depending on our accuracy and speed. It was a heavy responsibility for a group of guys who, just months earlier, had been civilians. The training intensified, the instructors introduced more complex scenarios, and raised performance standards. The physical conditioning became more demanding, preparing the men for the rigors of combat deployments. As one instructor bluntly told them, "In Europe, you'll be moving your howitzer through mud, snow, and debris. You'll be tired, scared, and possibly under fire. If you can't perform your duties under those conditions, men will die." This stark reality transformed their perspective on training. What had initially seemed like arbitrary drills and excessive repetition now took on profound significance. Every procedure practiced to the point of automatic response was one less thing to worry about when shells started falling nearby. "We started timing ourselves," Harrington said, "competing against our previous best times, finding small ways to improve efficiency, figuring out how to communicate with minimal words. It became an obsession, how to shave seconds off every action, because we understood those seconds might save lives." By the time they completed their 3-month training cycle, Harrington's crew could emplace their howitzer in under 2 minutes, process fire mission data in seconds, and put the first round downrange with remarkable accuracy. They could maintain their weapon blindfolded, troubleshoot common problems on the fly, and operate effectively, even when missing crew members. What they couldn't know was that the skills they had so diligently acquired would soon be tested in circumstances far more demanding than anything their instructors could simulate. As 1943 drew to a close and the plans for Operation Overlord took final shape, artillery units like theirs were preparing to deploy to England for the final staging of the most ambitious amphibious invasion in military history. For James Harrington and his fellow artillerymen, the classroom phase was over. The practical examination was about to begin in the hedgerows and bocage country of Normandy, where German defenders awaited, and where American artillery would face its greatest challenge and achieve its greatest triumph. The invasion fleet stretched across the English Channel like a man-made archipelago, thousands of vessels carrying the hopes of free nations and the implements of modern warfare. Among the landing craft, transport ships, and naval escorts were specialized vessels carrying the artillery that would support the infantry once they established a beachhead. Due to its size and weight, the 105mm Howitzer couldn't land with the first assault waves. The initial plan called for lighter 75mm pack howitzers to provide immediate artillery support, with the heavier 105mm howitzers following once suitable landing areas were secured. Harrington and his fellow artillerymen from the 903rd Field Artillery Battalion waited aboard the transport ship, listening to distant thunder of naval guns bombarding the Normandy coastline. Their howitzers, securely lashed to the deck, had been waterproofed for the landing, breech mechanisms coated with special grease, barrels sealed, and electrical components protected against saltwater intrusion. "We couldn't see the beaches from our position," Harrington recalled, "but we could hear the bombardment and see flashes on the horizon. We knew things weren't going exactly to plan from the radio traffic. The landing areas were heavily contested, especially Omaha Beach. We might have to wait longer than expected to get ashore." The men had trained extensively for amphibious operations in England, practicing loading and unloading their howitzers from landing craft, establishing firing positions on narrow beachheads, and coordinating with naval gunfire support. But as with all military operations, the reality proved messier than the plan. "We finally got the order to prepare for landing around 1400 hours on June 7th, D-Day +1, Harrington said. "Our howitzers were loaded onto LCMs, landing craft, mechanized, using ship's cranes. We followed them down cargo nets into the landing craft, which was tricky in full combat gear, with the craft rising and falling with the waves. The journey to the beach was tense. German artillery still occasionally fired on the landing areas, and underwater obstacles posed hazards to the landing craft. When they finally grounded on the sand, the bow ramp dropped, and the real work began. Getting a 2-ton howitzer off a landing craft and across a beach is not something you forget," Harrington noted dryly. "The sand bogged down our trucks, so we had to manhandle the howitzers in many places, using logs as rollers. It took us nearly 4 hours to move our 6 guns just 500 yards inland to our first firing position. This initial position was far from ideal, too close to the beach with limited fields of fire and virtually no cover from counter-battery fire. But the tactical situation was urgent. German counterattacks threatened the fragile beachhead, and artillery support was desperately needed. We got our first fire mission around 1800 hours, Harrington remembered. Coordinates for a German infantry concentration moving toward our positions from the south. We were still setting up, still brushing sand out of the mechanisms, but we had to respond immediately. The training at Fort Sill now paid dividends. Despite the chaos of the beachhead, despite their exhaustion after the channel crossing and difficult landing, the gun crews functioned with mechanical precision. Within minutes, all 6 howitzers of the battery were firing at the German positions, delivering devastating concentrations of high explosive onto the approaching enemy forces. That first fire mission lasted about 20 minutes, Harrington recalled. We fired nearly 300 rounds across the battery. When it was over, we received word that the attack had been broken up, our first concrete evidence that what we were doing actually mattered. As the Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, the artillery moved with them, leapfrogging batteries forward to maintain continuous fire support. This required a carefully orchestrated movement plan. Some batteries would displace forward while others remained in position, ensuring that artillery support was never completely unavailable. We typically moved as a 4-gun platoon, Harrington explained. 2 guns would remain in position while the other 4 moved forward. Once the 4 were established and ready to fire, the remaining 2 would join them. It kept at least some artillery available at all times. The terrain of Normandy presented unique challenges. The infamous hedgerows, ancient earthen embankments topped with dense vegetation, divided the landscape into hundreds of small fields, creating perfect defensive positions for German troops and limiting mobility for Allied forces. The hedgerows were a nightmare for artillery, said Lieutenant Wilson. They limited our fields of observation, making it difficult for forward observers to spot targets. They channeled our infantry into predictable avenues of approach where they could be ambushed, and they restricted our ability to displace quickly when German counter-battery fire came in. Despite these challenges, the American artillery adapted. Forward observers began using innovative techniques, climbing trees or church steeples, to gain better vantage points. Fire direction centers developed pre-planned concentrations on likely enemy positions, and the gun crews became experts at rapid emplacement in confined spaces, often setting up their howitzers in small Norman orchards or farmyards. We got very good at squeezing our howitzer into tiny spaces, Harrington noted. Sometimes we had just a few meters of clearance for the gun tube when firing at high angles. We learned to remove branches, clear obstacles, and make maximum use of whatever position we were assigned. The effectiveness of American artillery quickly became apparent to both sides. German prisoners consistently reported that artillery was the most feared American weapon, more than tanks or aircraft. The ability to deliver accurate, sustained fire regardless of weather conditions gave Allied commanders a tremendous advantage. As June turned to July, the Battle of Normandy intensified. The German defenders fought tenaciously, making the Allied advance a grueling, yard-by-yard struggle. Artillery became increasingly important, breaking up German counterattacks and supporting Allied assaults on fortified positions. We fired almost continuously during the push toward St. Lo, Harrington recalled. Our barrels would get so hot that the paint would bubble and peel. We rotated crews to allow some men to rest while others kept the guns firing. During the heaviest periods, we were going through close to 500 rounds per gun per day. The physical demands on the gun crews were enormous. Each projectile had to be manually loaded, each powder charge adjusted, each firing solution implemented precisely. The men worked in shifts, snatching a few hours of sleep when possible, often in foxholes right next to their howitzers. We lived by our guns, said Harrington, ate beside them, slept beside them, sometimes for weeks at a position. They became extensions of ourselves, and we took their care very personally. A dirty breech mechanism or worn elevating gears could mean the difference between life and death for the infantry we were supporting. The effectiveness of American artillery reached its apex during Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944. In preparation for this offensive, Over 1,000 artillery pieces, mostly 105mm and 155mm howitzers, were concentrated on a narrow front. When the order came to commence firing, they delivered one of the most intensive artillery bombardments of the war. "We fired continuously for over 2 hours," Harrington remembered. "The noise was beyond description. You felt it in your chest, in your bones, rather than heard it. The ground shook constantly. When we finally ceased fire and the infantry moved forward, they found German positions completely shattered, the defenders dazed and disoriented. The breakout succeeded, creating a gap in German lines that Allied armored units exploited, finally breaking free of the hedgerow country and racing across France. For the artillery, this created new challenges, keeping up with rapidly advancing forces, managing increasingly extended supply lines, and operating in more fluid tactical situations. But these were good problems to have. The static warfare of the hedgerows gave way to war of movement, where American advantages in mobility, firepower, and logistics could be fully leveraged. As summer turned to fall, Allied forces pushed steadily eastward, with the artillery continuing its crucial supporting role. For James Harrington and his gun crew, the Normandy campaign represented their baptism of fire, the first real test of their training and abilities. They had passed that test admirably, proving that the intensive preparation at Fort Sill had prepared them well for the realities of modern artillery warfare. What they couldn't know was that an even greater challenge awaited them in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, where a desperate German gamble would test Allied forces to their limits and where American artillery would play perhaps its most decisive role of the entire war. December 16, 1944. Under cover of pre-dawn darkness and heavy fog, 23 German divisions surged forward into the Ardennes forest along the Belgian-German border, catching American forces completely by surprise. Hitler's desperate gamble, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. The 903rd Field Artillery Battalion, including Harrington's battery, was positioned near the northern shoulder of the German advance, supporting the 2nd Infantry Division. When the attack began, they found themselves directly in the path of elements of the German 6th Panzer Army. "We were awakened by the sound of distant gunfire around 0530, Harrington recalled. "Initially, we thought it was just harassing fire. The Germans occasionally shelled our positions to disrupt sleep, but the intensity kept increasing, and soon we were getting urgent calls from the FDC to prepare for fire missions." The situation rapidly deteriorated as reports filtered in. German armor breaking through American lines, communication outages, units being overrun or surrounded. The battery received orders to prepare for possible displacement, military language for a rapid withdrawal. The temperature was well below freezing, with snow on the ground and thick fog limiting visibility to less than 50 yards, Harrington said. These were the worst possible conditions for artillery operations. Our mechanisms were sluggish from the cold, ammunition was difficult to handle with gloved hands, and laying the guns accurately was challenging without clear reference points. Despite these difficulties, the battery began firing support missions for infantry units trying to stem the German advance. The Fire Direction Center was flooded with urgent requests. German tanks at coordinates, such and such. Infantry concentrations here, assembly areas there. The gun crews worked frantically, swinging their howitzers to new deflections, adjusting quadrant elevations, and firing as rapidly as safety permitted. We could hear the German artillery getting closer, Harrington remembered. Their 88mm guns had a distinctive sound, sharper and more cracking than our howitzers. With each passing hour, those sounds grew nearer. We knew if we could hear them, they could certainly range us. Around noon, the battery received the dreaded order to displace. German armored units had broken through to the south and were threatening to envelop their position. They had 20 minutes to hitch their howitzers to their prime movers and move to a new position 3 miles to the northwest. Breaking down a howitzer position in 20 minutes under normal conditions is challenging, Harrington explained. Doing it in freezing temperatures on snow-covered ground With enemy forces approaching and occasional artillery rounds landing nearby, that tests everything you've learned. Once again, the relentless training at Fort Sill proved its worth. The gun crews fell into their practiced routines, securing the breech, installing the travel lock, raising the trails, lowering the howitzer onto its firing platform, hitching it to the truck. Despite numbed fingers, despite the sound of battle growing ever closer, they completed the displacement within the allotted time. The new position was in a small clearing in a pine forest, offering better concealment from German observation, but limiting their fields of fire. They had barely finished emplacing the howitzers when new fire missions began arriving. Desperate calls from infantry units trying to establish defensive positions along the northern shoulder of the German breakthrough. We fired continuously for the next 72 hours, Harrington recalled. We rotated men in and out, allowing them to warm up briefly in a nearby farmhouse. But the guns never fell silent. The Germans were pushing hard, and our infantry needed every shell we could deliver. The Battle of the Bulge became the defining moment for American artillery in the European theater, as German armored spearheads drove deep into Allied lines, creating the bulge that gave the battle its name. Artillery units often found themselves directly engaged with enemy forces. Many batteries were forced to fire over open sights at approaching tanks, a direct fire role for which the 105mm Howitzer was not primarily designed. We had trained for direct fire against tanks, Harrington noted, but it wasn't our preferred role. The howitzer's relatively low muzzle velocity made it less effective than dedicated anti-tank weapons. But when German armor appeared on the edge of our position on December 18th, we had no choice. Using special high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition, Harrington's battery engaged 3 German Panzer IV tanks that had broken through infantry positions to their east. 2 were disabled by direct hits, while the third withdrew after its accompanying infantry was dispersed by airburst rounds. It was the only time during the war that we actually saw the enemy we were firing at, Harrington recalled. Usually, we were miles behind the front lines, firing at coordinates on a map. But during those chaotic days of the Bulge, the front lines were fluid, sometimes non-existent. We were part of the front line. As the battle progressed, the weather cleared, allowing Allied air power to enter the fight. But artillery remained the most consistent and effective response to German movements. Field artillery battalions fired record numbers of rounds, sometimes exhausting their ammunition supplies and requiring emergency airdrops of additional shells. We fired so many rounds that the rifling in our barrels began to wear significantly, Harrington said. This affected accuracy and range, requiring adjustments to our firing tables. Ordinarily, barrels would be replaced after a certain number of rounds. But during the Bulge, there simply wasn't time. We kept firing, accepting the gradually decreasing accuracy as the price of survival. By late December, the German offensive had lost momentum. American forces stabilized their lines and began counterattacking. The artillery, which had played such a crucial role in blunting the German thrust, now supported the Allied counteroffensive to eliminate the Bulge. For Harrington and his fellow artillerymen, the Battle of the Bulge represented the most intense period of the war. They had fired more rounds under worse conditions, with greater tactical uncertainty than at any other time. They had proved definitively that the American artillery system, from the training of gun crews to the design of the weapons to the fire direction methodology, was equal to the greatest challenges of modern warfare. We fired over 15,000 rounds from our 6 howitzers during those 2 weeks, Harrington recalled. That's about 250 rounds per gun per day, an extraordinary rate of fire that pushed both men and machines to their limits. But when it was over and the German offensive had been defeated, we knew we had been part of something historic. As Allied forces pushed into Germany in the spring of 1945, the artillery continued its vital supporting role. But the nature of the war was changing. German resistance became more fragmented, less coordinated. The massive artillery concentrations that had characterized the Normandy and Ardennes campaigns gave way to smaller, more targeted missions against specific strong points or isolated units. The last few months of the war were almost anticlimactic for us, Harrington admitted. After what we'd been through in the Bulge, the advance into Germany seemed relatively straightforward. The German army was clearly breaking apart, though they still fought fiercely in places. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. For the men of the 903rd Field Artillery Battalion, the end brought a mixture of relief, pride, and uncertainty about the future. Many expected to be redeployed to the Pacific for the planned invasion of Japan, but the atomic bombings and Japan's subsequent surrender in August eliminated that necessity. By late 1945, the massive American artillery force that had played such a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany was being rapidly demobilized. Gun crews that had worked together for years were broken up as men returned to civilian life. The howitzers themselves were either placed in storage, transferred to Allied nations, or designated for use by the drastically reduced post-war Army. James Harrington returned to Illinois in January 1946, resuming his interrupted education and eventually becoming an engineer. He remained in contact with several members of his gun crew throughout his life, attending reunions of the 903rd Field Artillery Battalion until his death in 1989. The story of Harrington and his fellow artillerymen exemplifies a broader narrative of America's World War II experience. Ordinary citizens transformed by extraordinary circumstances, rising to meet challenges they could never have imagined in peacetime. The artillery crews represented a cross-section of American society, men from diverse backgrounds, educations, and regions, united by common purpose and forged into highly effective teams through rigorous training and shared hardship. Their contribution to victory was immense, yet often overlooked in popular histories that focus on infantry combat or armored warfare. But military professionals and historians recognize that American artillery, centered on the versatile 105mm Howitzer, constituted perhaps the U.S. Army's most effective combat arm during World War II. The 105mm Howitzer itself remained in U.S. military service long after World War II ended. Redesignated as the M101A1 in 1962, it served in Korea and Vietnam before finally being replaced by newer models in the 1970s. Even today, modernized versions remain in service with many armies worldwide, a testament to the excellence of its original design. But the true legacy of the artillery in World War II lies not in the weapon itself, but in the men who mastered it, men like James Harrington, who transformed from civilians into technical specialists capable of delivering precise, devastating firepower exactly where and when it was needed. Their story deserves to be remembered alongside those of the infantry who stormed the beaches and the airmen who took the war to the German homeland. In the complex orchestra of modern warfare, artillery has been called the king of battle, and the men who served the guns were its indispensable musicians. Through intensive training, remarkable adaptability, and unflinching courage, they helped write the score of Allied victory, one carefully calculated firing solution at a time. The final salvo of a howitzer creates a distinctive sound. Not just the initial sharp crack of the firing, but the long, rolling echo that follows, rebounding from hillsides and buildings before gradually fading away. It's an apt metaphor for the legacy of artillery in World War II, whose influences continued to reverberate long after the guns fell silent. Today, military historians recognize American field artillery as one of the decisive factors in the European theater. German generals in post-war interviews consistently cited it as the most effective and feared American combat arm. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, remarked that American artillery was excellent, both in material and in the tactical handling of it. What made this excellence possible? The transformation of ordinary citizens into skilled artillerymen through a training regimen of unprecedented thoroughness and intensity. The training system we developed during the war represented a revolution in military education, explained Colonel William Buster, who served as Director of Instruction at the Field Artillery School after the war. We took men with limited technical backgrounds and, in a matter of months, turned them into specialists who could operate complex equipment with remarkable precision under the most adverse conditions. That methodology influenced military training across all branches for decades afterward. The story of men like Private James Harrington offers valuable insights even today. Their experience demonstrates how intensive, realistic training can prepare individuals to perform effectively in circumstances far more demanding than they could have imagined. It shows how seemingly mundane repetition and drill create the foundation for success when stakes are highest. And it illustrates how technical competence, when widely distributed throughout an organization, creates resilience and adaptability in crisis situations. For the artillerymen themselves, the war left indelible marks. Many, like Harrington, rarely spoke about their experiences until decades later. When they did, they often focused not on the danger or the hardship, but on the profound bonds formed with their fellow crew members and the quiet pride they took in their technical mastery. We knew we weren't the ones directly facing the enemy most times, Harrington reflected in that 1975 oral history interview. The infantry had it worse, no question. But we also knew that when they called for artillery support, their lives depended on our speed and accuracy. That responsibility, knowing that your calculations and actions directly affected whether other Americans lived or died, that stays with you forever. The men who operated the 105mm Howitzers came from every corner of America and every walk of life. They returned to those diverse origins after the war, becoming teachers, engineers, factory workers, farmers, and businessmen. They built the post-war American prosperity, rarely mentioning their wartime service unless pressed. But occasionally, when thunder rolled across summer skies, many would pause briefly, listening with particular attention. The sound reminded them of distant fire missions, of coordinates quickly calculated, of well-worn breaches smoothly operated, of lanyard pulled and earth trembled, of the time when they stood at the fulcrum of history, helping to tip the balance toward freedom. Would you have broken protocol to save your unit? Would you have defied orders to deliver that fire mission if you believed it necessary? Each artilleryman faced moments where rigid adherence to procedure might have been less effective than improvisation and initiative. Their ability to balance discipline with adaptability made American artillery not just powerful, but responsive to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Share this story so others remember what courage really means, not just facing enemy fire, but accepting the immense responsibility of supporting those who do, with every calculation precise and every action performed with unwavering dedication to those who depend on your skill and speed. For in the end, the story of the 105mm Howitzer is not really about the weapon at all. It's about the transformation of ordinary Americans into extraordinary specialists, about the triumph of training and teamwork over chaos and fear, about the quiet competence that ultimately proves more decisive than dramatic heroics. It's about men like James Harrington who never considered themselves heroes, but who mastered their craft so thoroughly that they changed the course of history, one carefully calculated firing solution at a time.